Well, so what you must know is I'm the entertainment, okay? because I was just sitting here and listening, and I could not keep myself away. I have my other presentation I'm preparing for that I'm giving my specialist presentation within my seminar tomorrow. But I could not keep myself away. I came from the library because I wanted to hear. I'm so excited about what you're doing here. And so when one person wasn't able to come, as Michal said, she said, well, could you say something? I said, could I say something? What could I say? And then I started thinking of some things to say. So it's really snippets. So that really is what it's about. So I thought that I would talk with you a little bit about some of the things that humanists and natural scientists can learn from one another. And I'm excited by some of what I've heard of the ways that people are working together. And so I just have ideas that have come to me, things that I would like to learn, and things that I would like to teach. So, this isn't working. It's have to go this way. Okay, let's see, how is this not working? There, okay, yes. So, I would like to propose mutual learning, and the problem is that we each don't necessarily think we have anything to learn from the other. I think I didn't mean humans, I meant humanists. Humanists deal with the cultural artifacts of human beings, not with other species. And that, for us, is a given, and I would like to challenge it. What difference would it make if humanists would look at humans in the context of other beings? We've heard about hominins, but also other species. And natural scientists can teach us how to see humans in relation to other species. I want to give an example that I puzzle about. I don't know an answer, but it's something I puzzle about. There may be somebody in the room who can help me. So you see, part of my goal here of why I said, well, yes, to Michal yesterday when she said, could you speak? I said to myself, well, maybe I'll be able to connect with somebody. You know, maybe somebody will take some research in a direction and I could collaborate with you in some way. So I am a historian of slavery, especially in early Christianity, but also I've worked collaboratively with those who've worked on slavery in other periods. It has been present in human society for the last several millennia. Contrary to popular opinion, it did not die out in the Middle Ages. It continued, and it has never died out. We have it in the world today. The International Labor Organization estimates that 20.2 million persons today live in forced labor, which is more than at any other point in history. So a question that I have is, could the urge to obtain resources for oneself and one's children be deep in our DNA? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if people can find the answer to that. I'm suspicious of some of the ways that evolutionary psychologists think about humans. They tend to think about this in a deterministic way, whereas what I would be interested in thinking is if there is such an urge to obtain these resources, especially for one's offspring, how would society then deal with that if there is some kind of a genetic urge? And I know that biologists will sometimes speak about slavery with respect to certain species of ants. And I think here is one area where one has to think about what exactly slavery is. If it's a symbiotic relationship, does that necessarily make it a slavery relationship? Because it pushes us to think, if biologists would use the word slavery with respect to ants, what is slavery? What do you mean by it? You don't have money, so therefore there's not an issue of not giving money, but giving wages. There's not an issue of passports, being able to leave because you don't have your papers, which would be an issue today. So what kind of force is involved? A sociologist who's done an international comparison of slavery, Orlando Patterson, has argued that there are two essential elements to slavery, namely natal alienation, being taken from one's own place of home, and social death, being cut off from kin, not having a place in society. Now, would those apply to other species or not? I don't know. What I have seen is, in what I'm working on right now, I've worked this year especially on several early Christian groups that in some way resisted slavery. It's very rare. There was not an abolitionist movement in antiquity, but there were some that resisted. And I have identified 5, which is, of course, small. And for anybody who wants to do statistics, you know, I know you wanted 100 Ashkelon babies to be able to do your study, or at least 100 humans or something. And so I don't have that. That's what I have in antiquity. Also, that's also what fascinates me about antiquity, is how do you work with very small data sets. There is a considerable correlation among these groups with changed gender roles. So one might think, well, okay, if you reject the hierarchy of gender roles, then you're also going to reject slavery. Well, it actually doesn't carry through. As I looked through, it's sufficient but not necessary. It's necessary but not sufficient. The best predictor, at least of this small sample, is a celibate life without children to whom to pass on one's wealth. That raises for me a question of biology. You know, is it then you feel the need to have those resources for your children, and you're not going to give up on the wealth produced by slavery? One of the things that humanists can teach natural scientists is to pose better questions and to be more self-critical about how culture influences one's questions. So another area in which I've worked is sexual relations between women in early Christianity and the ancient Mediterranean. And I found many sources on this subject that had not been studied before. And in that, I also looked at how sexual relations between males are understood. And in the ancient sources, in the ancient Greek sources, just to take one example of the Roman and Greek and Jewish and early Christian and so forth, the ancient Greek, but that carried through to some other cultures also in the Mediterranean. They would not have understood the idea gay versus heterosexual. That wasn't the way they thought. They didn't think of it in that way. They thought of it, with males in particular, as active versus passive. So in other words, a man who penetrated a boy and who penetrated his wife, he wasn't gay, he wasn't bisexual, he was the penetrator. And the one who was penetrated, whether a female or a male, was the penetrated. That was the principal distinction, the active-passive distinction. They also had some other categories. Ancient astrologers, for example, write about different kinds of erotic orientations being caused by the constellation under which one was born. And these can include being attracted to a richer person or a poorer person, an older person or a younger person. So they had orientation. They weren't the ones that we would recognize, and they wouldn't recognize ours. So when today geneticists try to find a gay gene, it to them is just kind of an obvious thing. You'd look for, can you switch off this gene, and then the fruit fly is now fruitless. You've maybe heard of this research. And so that fruit fly is attracted to the same sex rather than the opposite sex. That seems like common sense. The Greeks wouldn't have understood it. They would not have set the experiment up that way. And I once said this at a conference at Harvard Medical School to Dean Hamer, who was one of the geneticists who's worked on this gay gene issue. And I said, well, I spoke about ancient Greece and so forth, ancient cultures, and then I also spoke about in some areas in Latin America, you continue to have this distinction as well, where the passive and active is the most important issue. And his response was, at a conference at the Harvard Medical School, I have seen some of these men from Latin America, and believe me, they're gay. I turned to the neighbor next to me and I said, is that science? Believe me, they're gay. In other words, I didn't see a desire to engage the critical question, why am I posing the research question this way? Does it have something to do with my culture? And how might I think of it in a more culturally aware way, which then might mean that you would do different kinds of experiments. I now want to switch. This is snippets after. I'm just going to switch to another area that I have found an exciting form of collaboration between those who work on humanistic research and those who work on natural scientific research. Dr. Scheidel, who has studied in Egypt Christian graves in late antiquity, so 3rd, 4th, 5th century, because these graves give the date of death. So it's a Christian practice to give the date of death. And on the basis of his work, which brought in epidemiology, various kinds of sources on malaria, he was able to ascertain that there were 2 peak seasons of malaria per year. So it was fascinating how someone working on the question of disease and the history of ancient disease was able to use Christian grave inscriptions to help to come to a better result. Next snippet, parchment. I heard a couple of the speakers here say the parchment of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how exciting it would be to do some DNA research on those. Well, the question is, what is parchment? So the English word parchment comes via the French word parchemin, which comes from the Greek word pergamene, which is used by the natural historian Pliny when he describes the city of Pergamum, which is in Asia Minor, an ancient city in Asia Minor in the Hellenistic period, that is before the Roman period, where there was a conflict between Egypt and Pergamum, which were both important Hellenistic regions, and they refused to send them papyrus. So they began to make their own paper writing, their own writing material out of leather. So this is a legend. Scholars don't think that it really is, accurate, but nevertheless, it is where the word comes from. Now, it's very interesting what exactly parchment is. So it's usually defined as sheep or calf skin, so not every kind of skin, that is cleaned. Every leather has to be cleaned anyway, so you scrape it, remove the hairs and so forth. Stretch, this is essential. You stretch it out on a rack, soaked in lime, not tanned. That's part of the current definition, not tanned, and has chalk applied to it afterwards, and then maybe rubbed with a pumice stone. And then it makes a very, very good writing surface, and it lasts for centuries. This is the medieval definition. So the question is, what actually would work for antiquity? Well, there's been some interesting research in just the last 10 years. So, for example, there's been research on northern Ethiopia, and this researcher found that in the year 800 BCE, there is evidence for the production of Ethiopian parchment for writing, and that the evidence is continuous, that it's a very traditional form of preparation, but that in Ethiopia, apparently, because of the bacteria in the environment, the lime is not necessary. So in other words, then, does that call into question whether lime is an essential part of the process of making parchment or not? Here's a kind of parchment without lime. And it's much earlier than we would have thought. So this would undercut that Pergamum thesis. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a couple of you have referred to it as parchment, and we usually do refer to the Dead Sea Scrolls as parchment in English. In some other languages, especially German, they're very hesitant to do so because it doesn't fit the medieval definition, because there is some tanning, lightly tanned. So the question then is, how much tanning is there before it's no longer parchment and instead should be called leather? So what I would love, now I know these really are different studies. They would require different grants, it's different studies. But I would love to see more research on the process. So some people want to do DNA analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think it would be very interesting also to do a survey of the ancient parchment fragments that we have, and we have entire codices. The Codex Sinaiticus is a beautiful full codex. Codex is the shape of a book, which is what parchment is really suited for. It's not so well suited for scrolls, which is the earlier shape. But I think it would be wonderful to have a full overview so that we could get to an ancient definition of parchment. What are the range of methods that are used to produce this, which differs apparently from the Middle Ages? And I think that what is happening with the definition of parchment is that one is literally using a Eurocentric definition, which is you take what you have in the Middle Ages and you say this is the real parchment, and then anything before that is not real parchment. So I'd love to know it. And what librarians in the United States are increasingly doing is simply speaking of membranes. So as to avoid this question of how, what if you have a little bit of tanning, or what if you don't have lime? Let's just call it a membrane. So What's that? It's a politically correct term. Exactly, exactly. Okay, so that's for my PowerPoint, but because I was just kind of pulled off the street here to give you this presentation, and I'm preparing another one for tomorrow, I did have a few other ideas. So another area that interests me, another snippet, is the question of purple. So there's been a lot of interest in Israel in techelet, which is the blue color that is now being produced from the Murex trunculus. And in antiquity, along the northern part of Israel, which is also where there were Phoenicians, as well as up the Phoenician coast, Tyre and Sidon in particular, but Tyre in antiquity was known as the site where the best purple came from. And it was called Tyrian Purple. In the year 301, there's an edict of the Emperor Diocletian who fixed prices. That is, he fixed an upper limit for prices to keep the prices down, and he set the prices for various locations. It usually was where like Laodicean wool was the most expensive, and Tyrian purple was the most expensive, and so forth. So it's a fascinating way to see something both about the transfer of goods and services, as well as about the what was highly valued. And so what's fascinating is that the purple that is produced in the Phoenician cities is usually purple, argaman in Hebrew. But this blue color is now being produced from one form of the snail. There are three types of the Murex snail, and the other two types of the Murex snail also have to have some of the Murex trunculus in them. They have to have about 20% of it for them to work. But I have been fascinated by the question, why is some purple and some blue? So what I have read, I haven't gone into the scientific study of it, but I know that there are people working on it. I want to find out more about this, is that the blue, for one thing, the Talmud says that the color should be this color of the sea and the color of the sky because it reminds you of God on God's throne. Well, that's not purple, that's blue. But apparently, if you do the blue in the sunlight, you can produce the blue color of techelet, whereas if you do the purple, it should be overcast. Well, that raises for me the question then, though, how would the Phoenicians be producing so much of it when it was overcast? Would mean they'd have to be producing it in the wintertime. They don't have a lot of clouds in the summer. So in other words, there are just lots of questions for me that I haven't answered yet. And the reason that this has become of great interest to me is because in the New Testament, a woman by the name of Lydia is defined as a purple seller. And the Apostle Paul meets her at a synagogue. And so scholars have usually thought that she was a seller of the purple-colored purple, which is an expensive color, and that could well be. But being here and being in some contact with these discussions about techelet has raised for me the question whether she might have been selling techelet to the Jewish community. And to make the story more exciting, an inscription has been discovered from Tyre of a Jewish woman, apparently a Jewish woman because it has a menorah on her gravestone, selling purple. So was she selling techelet, or was she selling argaman, or was she selling both? So I think that there are still questions to be answered, and I think that they would be valuable for scholars of the Bible. How much time do I have? Okay, so I'll say a couple more things then. I'm also very interested in plants. I am a member of the New England Wildflower Society. I grow wildflowers in my garden. I'm very interested in plants. So, and I was so excited when I discovered the Arum palestinum growing not very far from my house, which is what I looked at it and thought, oh, it's a black calla lily. Well, that is one of the common names. It's native to this region, and I have been sending pictures of it to all my friends in the United States and saying it would have been worth it to come here just to see this flower. So that's how excited I get about wildflowers. So I'm also very interested in plants that are mentioned in the Bible and the Talmud and the Quran, and I've been in collaboration with, I may want to work with him, a botanist, an ethnobotanist who's worked on this region, who has written a couple of books on plants in the Bible and the Quran. And one of the plants that he has had a difficult time identifying, it's very difficult to identify some of these plants. So we're still, you know, haven't covered everything. And one of the plants is, oh, I see it's the Schlafstunde. Uh-oh. My goal was to keep you awake during the Schlafstunde, sorry. The mustard seed. So Jesus tells the parable of the mustard seed, and he says it grows very quickly, and it turns into a large tree so that even the birds of the air nest in it. A mustard seed has not been, a mustard plant has not been found to date that the birds of the air can nest in. This is a problem. So this botanist, John Lytton Musselman, has proposed 4 different types. He found one growing here in this region that's kind of big, but I think that more can be done on these plants, which then also would help us to understand biblical texts better. So thus far my snippets, and thank you for your interest.
Do you have any questions?
Yes?
So biblical names of plants and animals, how well can we identify today what they are? I mean, mustard, you say, but couldn't, in terms of, when they use the word mustard, what might that mean?
Well, that's exactly the problem. Exactly. So, it could be something in the cabbage family. It could be, so that's precisely, because of course they're not using the Linnaean names. They're not using the Latin names. They're using the common names. And sometimes we can identify.
I mean, the way we categorize different plants and animals might be completely different from the way we categorize.
Precisely, and that's the difficulty. And then one of the things that we can do is we can look at other ancient writers who wrote about those plants, such as Pliny, who wrote a natural history, or sometimes they're written about in medical writers. So there are some ways to help identify them, but it's actually very difficult. So it's a very interesting area of research. Please.
Over coffee.
What's that?
Over coffee.
Over coffee? Yeah. What you mean? What? What?
No, because I have a lot of stories.
Oh, great! Wonderful. Okay. Yes.
Just to comment on the medieval definition of parchment, colleagues in York, the species of parchment, they find that a lot of parchments are in fact goat, especially from Mediterranean.
Yes. Well, and of course in the Middle Ages, one of the things that they did was they actually used embryos. And so the question is, did they perform abortions to get the embryonic seed? Because then it's very fine and it is transparent. So it's very highly valued. Or were they miscarriages or what? But yes, so goats can also be used. And so that's why this definition that I put out, people do distinguish sometimes. I mean, I think we need better definitions based on what we actually have. So I'm interested in speaking with you or with anyone else. Yes.
No questions? All right.
Okay.
Fine.